and welcome to another episode of Los Banos Talk. My name is Justin Collins. In tonight's episode, we're going to talk about some of the changes and amendments that have been proposed and somewhat accepted by council for basically the city's growth plan, its sphere of influence, annexation plan, and ultimately, really part of the general plan. So, if you're interested in growth, the future of the city, where things are going to be built, and what the city might look like in 20 years, you'll definitely want to check this episode out. And I'll get into all of that in just a moment, right after a brief message from our sponsor.
So a lot of people ask what our academy has to offer. First and foremost, we are a martial arts academy. We have a very structured curriculum. Parents always ask me, why should we bring our children here? Like, what can you have to offer us? And, I've been teaching probably since I was 13 years old. And I knew that I always wanted to do martial arts. I solely focus on teaching and trying to be the best mentor and just inspire today's youth through kicking and punching.
And we're back. Thanks for watching. So, last city council meeting, the city council was given a presentation by staff that basically explained what we have, what was to be planned for 2030, and then what they were proposing now through 2040. And the other thing is that they made a lot of changes to this plan. And then there's also going to be an opportunity for a community workshop. So you're going to get to put your input in as well. So I'm going to show you the map, and it's really confusing, but I'll walk you through it so it makes sense. So right here, what we're essentially looking at is this is a slide from the council meeting. Now, the legend that they have down here is kind of not showing well because it's covered up by the date. And you can tell this meeting was on March 30th. But I remember what they were basically saying, and it was a little confusing. So I don't want you to look too much at this and try to figure it out. Let me just basically tell you what it is and what it means. Okay, so let's start with some definitions and some colors. Okay, so sphere of influence. Okay, so that was an interesting term, and it was kind of confusing to some, and it took some explanation. But basically, the sphere of influence is the current sphere of influence is this solid yellow line, the solid yellow line. That is the present day sphere of influence. This solid white line is the city limit. Now, technically speaking, and this was explained, the white line, the city limit, within that, the city actually has legislative authority and can actually control and make decisions and so on and so forth. What's in the sphere of influence is technically actually the county, but this is area where the city has some say, because what it can do is it can basically kind of plan those areas, and then the county has to essentially talk with the city before it does something. Could the county still do something the city doesn't want? Yes, but it's just harder. So this isn't actually become part of the city technically. It does not. But what it is, if it's in the sphere of influence, is that the city has some say over it, and that it likely in the future will become part of the city. But at this point, all that means is that it's kind of within its sphere of influence, but it's not truly part of the city. This dotted orange line, right? So this dotted orange line was the urban growth limit. So what this essentially was is this is an urban growth boundary, and this is the maximum limit of which you can do urban development, whether it be residential, business, etc. But that is the line or the limit at which the city can start, or businesses or people or developers could start building. So they would have to annex, right, a part of the city that's adjacent to the city, and then once annexed, they could start building, so long as they're within this line. So basically, This meeting set new guidelines for how new land would be annexed, what it could be used for, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll get into those guidelines in a minute, but this chart's pretty confusing still, so let me explain. So this was the existing urban growth boundary. The purple is areas that are being proposed to be annexed into the sphere of influence or continue to be part of the sphere of influence. Um, but we're also part of the old plan created in 2030. So basically, if back in 2030 they wanted to include it, and now in well, it was for 2030, but it was created in 2010. But basically, if this was intended for 2030, then that is what the purple means, and it's still desired now. Okay. And this is a staff recommendation. And they didn't go with this exactly. They made a lot of changes, and I'm going to draw those here. The red, the red areas you see here and here, these are areas that were, according to the 2010 for 2030, we're going to be part of the city's sphere and influence, but staff is recommending that they be taken out of the sphere of influence. The blue represents areas that are new. This is areas that the staff is proposing now become part of the sphere of influence, but that was not suggested back in 2010 for the plan going for 2030. So there was a couple things brought up at the meeting. Different people had different concerns over a couple of this, and they made some changes, quite a few changes actually to this. So what you're seeing is not really what it is, and so I'm going to draw it on here for you. So one of them was this area here, right? This area here is being proposed to taken out. So if you notice this dotted line, right? This dotted line, and this was explained in the meeting, was where the bypass would have gone. And so they want to basically keep this option open in the future if there's ever an intent to do a bypass. But it was explained that actually it wouldn't even have to be part of the city's sphere of influence in order to still complete the project, which is why the staff recommended to eliminate this part. It seemed like from the meeting that the council liked the idea of maintaining this part, and it seemed that they were good with eliminating these sections. However, they did make one change additionally. However, they did make one change here. So, because of future plans for the, some call it the bypass or the Pioneer Improvement Plan or what have you, essentially what they decided was that it would make sense if they took this corner right here, this part that is the intersection of Volta and Pioneer, and if they incorporated that. So this sphere of influence and this urban growth boundary seem to have been extended to here in the meeting. There was a couple other changes as well. Both Deborah Lewis and Brett Jones brought up this idea that they don't like the fact that this goes all the way down south to Copa de Oro, and they pointed out that this, impact the wetlands, etc. And they felt like it shouldn't go any lower than Pioneer. So what they essentially decided was this: they created the new southern boundary. So the new, this would be the equivalent of this orange dotted line right here along Pioneer. So this right here is no longer part of the urban development boundary, but this still remains. This still remains though as part of the sphere of influence. So this is still part of that sphere of influence here. So, and the reason why they're doing this is because they want to preserve this, as agricultural land, etc. But the thing is that they don't really want any more development, etc., going here. If they were to completely relinquish control, then they wouldn't have any say over it at all. So what they're doing is they want to keep it in their sphere of influence so they can actually prevent development on it. But essentially, they move this dotted line boundary up to here, and really the solid line moves to the new edge, which should be here. And again, the solid yellow, this is the sphere of influence, which is not quite as strong but has some say. This dotted line is the boundary for the urban growth, and the white line is the true city limit. But since they moved this up here from here to here, they talked about, in the future, going forward, where are we going to essentially, design or keep moving the city, right? So they talked about that, and essentially what they decided was this: that Henry Miller would now be, you could now think of Henry Miller as basically the northern limit of the city. This dotted line here, which is the urban boundary. Uh, so the idea is basically this would now be within the urban boundary limit. So future growth, whether it be business, residential, etc., a lot of it would happen here, and then basically the city's not going to spread any further south of Pioneer. So you can think of now as Pioneer being the southern border limit, and then Henry Miller Road being the northern border limit. And then they essentially talked about, well, which way do we go? Do we go east? Do we go west? It seemed they pretty much came to the conclusion that there's really no more space to go further east. As you go further east, you're essentially taking up more good farmland and real estate, but the land west of Los Banos is, especially once you get up to the foothills, is considered underused, or not quite as valuable. So basically, going forward, they want to start going west for development. So these are the main changes. This line right here was moved up to here, the urban development zone, to Henry Miller, and then these parts were brought back in. This corner was brought back in. Uh, Pioneer became the new lower limit, but then in exchange they increased it up here. So it's basically an even exchange, kind of going north instead of going south. But there was a little bit more that they talked about at the meeting as well. There were some other changes that were made specific to policy and what developers would have to do going forward, and how new land could be annexed into the city. And I'm going to show you that now as well. So basically, there's going to be a general plan, and in that general plan, that's where we're going to get some of these rules and regulations that basically kind of regulate a lot of how new annexation works, what can be developed, how, and basically what are the rules for development, what do developers need to know, and what do they need to do to meet the city's standards and requirements. This essentially establishes a requirement. So some of the things you might notice is that it would require that any land that's being annexed would have to be contiguous to the existing city limits, in other words, touching it. And that it also would have to be within the urban growth boundary. At least 75% of it has to be in the sphere of influence. As to meet the guidelines for the policies, we'll have to provide city utilities. Now, I found this point interesting. It says prior to annexation, the city must find the adequate police, fire, and other public safety services can be provided. But what defines adequate? Because frankly, if you think about it, we don't have enough police as is for our population size. So anything else, technically by default, this would disqualify anything else. But obviously, that's not what's going to happen. So I wonder really, how they're really going to enforce this or look at this or say, okay, you want to annex this new development, we need to hire two more police officers or something. I just don't really see this point number five. It sounds good on paper, but I just don't really see how it's going to be really enforced since we already don't have enough now. So we'd have to play catch up plus add some more. I don't know. I don't really, I feel like this is kind of lip service. I don't really think this is realistically gonna happen the way it's on paper, but that's what it says. This term here, mitigation, is rather vague as well, and there were some questions that were brought up about it. But essentially, what it's saying is that they should take good care to try to make sure that the development is not so impactful on parks and such, and not so harsh on public infrastructure. But again, it's kind of like it sounds good on paper, but specifically, what will this really mean? Rather vague. And the answer was, in my opinion, not that straightforward. Now, these are the guidelines that are supposed to be part of the new city residential and industrial plans. And there was some changes. So, some of you may have already noticed, right, that a lot of our streets don't have sidewalks. You may have noticed that some of the um, infrastructure, the landscaping, it's kind of all over the place in terms of there's not really like a uniform thing. Well, that's because apparently there actually was no plan prior to this plan. And now, once this is adopted, and it's technically not adopted yet, but once the general plan is adopted, these plans would go into effect. And then these requirements would be the new requirements that developers going forward would have to meet. But right now, these requirements do not exist. So I just want to make that clear. So a range of housing types, right, to ensure social and economically integrated neighborhoods. I'm guessing that means that there's going to be a requirement kind of for a mix of low, medium, and high income, or low, medium, moderate, but it's not really specific. It's kind of a vague, but it's not like a specific. I'm not seeing anything that's like, for every two of this type, you need one of this. It seems kind of somewhat subjective. So, a couple things that would change would be drainage facilities shall use green infrastructure or designed as natural waterways. So, that's kind of interesting. So, I guess they'd have to create some kind of natural canal or use some kind of existing natural waterway to function as drainage. A system of pedestrian trails, pathways, linear open spaces, corridors shall be provided to link residential neighborhoods, parks, schools, downtown shopping areas, and employment centers. Interesting. So basically, this is saying that developers are going to have to create some kind of walking path of sorts that's going to connect to other walking trails, which would theoretically someone could walk from their house to downtown in order to, I guess, meet this requirement. Now, some of these specific plans seem to be really liked by council members, particularly Section B of 10 was Deborah Lewis was very fond of. These would be the requirements that would come for if you were trying to make an industrial park. So this one's interesting. Provisions for services and amenities for employees such as recreation, childcare, and dining. So theoretically, this could basically say, okay, you want to build a factory, you need to have a child care facility, a cafeteria, and a basketball court in order to meet this requirement. Now, I thought about this, and I was thinking to myself, while I think it's great if a business is able to provide these things for their employees, that's awesome. But by making it a requirement, I wonder if we're going to have a lot of businesses or industry pass us up because we already have a hard time getting manufactured an industry into the city as is. I wonder if adding these kind of requirements will just cause those industry to just pick a different city. The other things are pretty straightforward. It's basically, minimize your impact on others, make sure you fit with the roadways, and you got to furnish all the stuff you're going to use. Pretty straightforward. But this section B right here is rather interesting. It really would increase the quality of life, arguably, for people. But I also wonder if this would be a genuine barrier to industry coming in. And I'm not really entirely sure what actually would meet these requirements, if it means they also need to have staff, or if they have to have cafeteria, or if it just means they have to have, or there needs to be a restaurant kind of nearby within a certain amount of distance, or if a taco truck, parks in the parking lot every, couple of days, does that meet the requirement? I'm honestly not sure, and it didn't really seem that straightforward in the meeting either. But this requirement here, I think, is interesting, and it's one that I would like to see a little bit more clarification on as to what exactly are they asking a new business development or industrial development to do, because depending upon how you interpret this, this is either a really tall order or it's just kind of like a soft suggestion. So, all in all, the city's growing. It's going to continue to grow. And we can kind of start to see a glimpse of what the future might look like. And now we have an idea of some of the standards that developers are going to have to start being guided by once this general plan goes into effect, which would then change the neighborhoods in the future. This wouldn't affect anybody currently living here, or wouldn't affect anybody who's currently already in a neighborhood that's complete, obviously, but this would affect future housing development, etc. And this would kind of give the city a more planned and uniform look. If you haven't already, please like, follow, subscribe to Los Panos Talk. We have Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and of course, LosPanosTalk.com. You can become a supporter of Los Panos Talk for just $4.99 a month and gain access to exclusive behind the scenes bonus content and opinion pieces, as well as access to the exclusive group Los Panos Talk Nation. Plus, get all the videos first and ad free. Once again, my name is Justin Collins, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.